This is Audiovisual Lecture 6, Part 2. So we've been talking about the pitch of the blade, or the blade angle, called the pitch of the propeller, and how that affects the distance that it travels forward in one rotation. So a lesser pitch means that it will travel less distance per rotation. The greater pitch will give it a greater distance traveled per rotation. Now, you would think then that every propeller would be twisted as far as possible to get the greatest distance forward per each revolution. But the problem with this is that as you do that, as you increase the angle of the blade, it has to work harder because it's pushing more air, it's moving more air, and a flatter surface of the propeller is coming into contact with the air. It's the exact same thing as taking the wing of an airplane and giving it a higher angle of attack. So this top example right here. So you have the blade set to this pitch, it travels this far in one rotation. That's like taking a wing and giving it this angle of attack, let's say. So let's say there's your angle of attack. The oncoming air is hitting it this way. This is the amount of angle of attack, right? Now, the second picture, so now you twist the blade even farther to get it to go more distance in one rotation. Of that is just like the wing, you're giving it a greater angle of attack. So more angle, and as we learned early on, that greater angle presenting more of the broadside of the wing to the wind is going to increase your induced drag, and it's going to slow the propeller down. It's like turning the propeller, trying to turn a propeller through molasses versus water. As it meets more air, there becomes more resistance, and there's only so much power in the engine, so the only thing it can do is slow down. So the propeller is going to turn more slowly. Now, to create the most power, the maximum power requires that the propeller spin as fast as possible. So to get the greatest amount of power possible out of the engine, you're going to have it turn this shorter distance. Because at that point, you're not concerned about as how fast you're going. You're concerned with how much power you're creating. And what's a condition where we're going to worry about that? Well, takeoff and situations in which we have to climb as quickly as possible. If you're trying to take off, you don't really care how fast you're going, over the ground. You're really only concerned with creating as much power as possible, because that's going to get you off the ground more quickly. This is exactly like the idea behind gearing a bicycle. So you have the bicycle in low gear. You're going to be pedaling like mad, and you're only going to be going forward half the pace that your friend is casually walking, right? So you're sitting on there like a cartoon, just pedaling madly, and you're going 2 miles an hour, right? All right, so that's this condition right here. It's turning a lot of rotations and only going forward like this, right? But that's where you get the most power. If you go up a hill, that's what you want. You want to have the most power. You don't really care how long it takes you to get up the hill, theoretically, but that's the point, is you want the most power to get up the hill. Now, once you've gotten to the top of the hill and you level out and you want to pass your friend, you're going to drop the bicycle into high gear, and you're going to start going forward a lot faster with fewer rotations. That's what this is right here. So now you're pedaling very slowly and lackadaisically, but you're going forward much faster because you're getting more distance out of each rotation of the pedals. So that's what's going on with the blade angle of the propeller. So somebody thought at some point early in aviation, well, wouldn't it be great if you didn't have to have just one or the other? Wouldn't it be great if you could take off with the propeller like this to get the most power, and then change it to this once you take off and level out? Same thing with the bicycle. Wouldn't it be great if you could have a bicycle that gave you a lot of power going up the hill, and then you could switch gears at the top and go faster with the same amount of power? So they came up with what was called they started coming up with what were called variable pitch propellers, where you could actually change the pitch of the propeller in flight, so that you could take off with this and change to this and then back to this to land. And the most common variant of that today is called a constant speed propeller, and we'll go into that in just a little bit. Other methods of doing this were with what were called ground adjustable propellers. This was where, when the airplane was on the ground, you could take pins out of it and twist the blades, put the pins back in, and that's the new pitch. But you could still only do it from the ground. Others had levers and mechanisms to where you took off with it in the takeoff setting, and then you'd get to altitude and you'd pull a switch and in the cockpit, and it would clunk and change into the cruise setting. So it just had two settings or a couple of different settings. But the one that was most efficient and that has stuck around even today is, like we said, what's called the constant speed propeller. Now, what this does, you have to think of it not so much in terms of blade angles, but as, like we say, a constant speed. So in a fixed pitch propeller, the throttle controls the speed of the propeller. If you push the throttle forward, the engine is going to spin faster and the propeller is going to spin faster. You have a gauge in the cockpit called an RPM gauge, just like your car, that tells you how fast the propeller is turning. And in a fixed pitch propeller airplane, the RPM gauge shows you both the speed of the engine and the speed of the propeller, because they're both connected and it's the same, it's a fixed pitch blade angle. Now, once you let's say that you're in a Cessna, with a fixed pitch propeller, and you pitch upwards and you start to climb. Well, you're going to start to slow down, and so if you leave the throttle where it is, as you go slower, the propeller is going to start to turn slower and the RPM is going to go down. If you pitch the airplane down and you leave the throttle where it is, you're going to go faster and the propeller is going to start to go faster and the RPM is going to go up. But the whole idea is to be efficient for different periods of flight. So the constant speed propeller keeps the propeller spinning at a consistent RPM regardless of how much power the engine is producing. So with a constant speed propeller, let's say you pitch up in a climb and leave the throttle where it is. The RPM is going to stay the same because it's maintaining a constant speed. Same thing if you pitch downwards. It's going to still have the same RPM because it's maintaining a constant speed. Now, how does it do that? Well, it has what's called a governor on it that controls the speed that it turns. So how can we control the speed of the propeller without adjusting the engine? Well, it's kind of like if you're familiar with a truck, a huge truck that uses engine braking to slow down. The engine's turning a certain speed, so it's not going to turn any faster than a certain speed. So if you use that to your advantage, you use the engine to slow down instead of the brakes. So that's kind of what you're doing here, just in reverse. So the propeller turns and has a certain amount of drag associated with that. Just like we were seeing over here when you change the angle of attack. At this lower angle of attack right here, there's less air resistance, so it's easier to turn. Here, it's harder to turn. So if you're turning with this angle of attack and you twist the blade like this, what do you think is going to happen to it? Well, it's going to slow down, right? Because you're increasing the drag. It's like you're, putting the brakes on or turning your hand this way out the side of the window. The airflow, the air resistance is going to slow it down. Same thing if you're like this. If you decrease that angle or flatten your hand or cut your parachute loose or whatever you want to call it, you're going to start to speed up, right? So if the propeller starts to speed up, the governor twists the blade like this, and that slows it down and keeps it constant. If it's like this and it starts to slow down, it twists it like this, less air resistance, it speeds back up and maintains that constant RPM. Now this is all very fluid. This isn't a chop, 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 motion like that. This is a very constant and continual motion such that it might, be doing this in flight. You can't actually see it or hear it, but it's making these minute corrections over and over and over again to maintain a constant RPM. As it accelerates, if it goes too fast, let's say that 2,000 RPM is our number. We're just going to write that down right there. 2,000 RPM, 2,000 revolutions per minute. So every minute, this propeller is turning 2,000 times. That's pretty fast, right? So it's like this. You know, here's our angle of attack, and the governor sees that it's 2,100 times, let's say. So it needs to slow it down, right? So it's going to twist the blade to where it's like this. That's more air resistance. The air resistance is going to slow it back down to 2,000. Now let's say you're like this, and it sees that it's spinning 1,900 now. Well, it's going to twist it like this, decrease the air resistance to bring it back up to 2,000 RPM. So it's doing this back and forth, you know, twisting the blade back and forth to maintain that consistent RPM, and that's what we call a constant speed propeller, and why. Now the cool part about these constant speed propellers is how they accomplish this. It's also probably the hardest to explain, but here goes. So a fixed pitch propeller is just carved out of a block of wood, and the center part is just kind of blockish so that you can actually bolt it to the engine. Well, a constant speed propeller blade, as it goes towards the hub or the center of the blade, becomes rounded. So here's the propeller coming in, here's the hub right here. It flutes out like this to where the part that attaches to the center is rounded in the center. You can kind of see that cross section right here. Because it's rounded, you can turn it. If you pull up on one side of it, it's going to twist the blade angle in that direction right there. And if you pull up on opposite sides of it, it's going to twist these blades in the opposite direction, which is what you want to do, right? To keep everything consistent on both sides. Now, most airplanes will use engine oil pressure to accomplish this. So oil inside the engine lubricates all the moving parts, lowers the temperature of the engine, and so forth. And there's a certain pressure of that oil inside the engine. And what a constant speed propeller uses to move is that oil pressure. The propeller's connected right to the engine, so it's easy to get the oil pressure there. So this is a cutaway of the center part of the propeller. So the blades go out like this in both directions, and this is where they meet in the middle, in that rounded shape. So oil pressure, the engine's back here. Let's turn it that way just to keep everything the same. So, oops. So the engine is back here, right? And this is the direction forward. So oil pressure comes in here, pushes on this little plate, that pushes outwards on this, and what these two arms do are pull upwards on opposite sides of the propeller. So as it goes up this way, it's going to twist the propeller blade this way on this side and this way on this side. If this plate goes back this way, it's going to let the propeller go back in the opposite direction. So by pulling up and down here, that's what's twisting the blades back and forth like that. So as we were talking about earlier, that's how the blade is changing shape to maintain a consistent speed on the propeller.